All right, hello everyone and welcome back. Let's get right into it today with a deep dive into a topic that's bound to be on your UPSC mains exam and might even pack up on the prelims. Same-sex marriage in India.
Oh, absolutely. It's one of those issues that just touches on so many themes that are relevant to the UPSC exam: legal interpretation, social change, human rights, even India's global standing.
It really is. And the Supreme Court has, well, they've been all over the headlines lately with their decisions on same-sex marriage. I think some people are finding it a little bit difficult to keep track of it all. So maybe can you just kind of walk us through the most recent rulings and what they actually mean?
Yeah, of course. So the big one, just last October in 2023, a five-judge bench of the Supreme Court rejected petitions to actually legalize same-sex marriage. But here's where it gets a little interesting. It wasn't a unanimous decision.
Really?
Yeah, it was a 3.2 majority, so that means two judges actually dissented. They felt same-sex marriage should be recognized.
Oh, wow. So even at the very top and the highest court, there's disagreement on this. That's interesting. Um, so what were the judges' arguments? I mean, what was the logic behind their decision for both the majority and those dissenting opinions?
Well, the majority opinion really focused on the existing legal framework in India and the parliament's role in, enacting these big societal changes. They basically said that it's not the court's place to redefine what marriage is.
Yeah.
It's up to the legislature to make those kinds of policy decisions.
Okay.
However, the dissenting judges, they argued that denying same-sex couples the right to marry is actually a clear violation of their fundamental rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution, especially Article 14, which talks about equality before the law. And they really emphasize that the court has this duty to protect individual rights, even if it means kind of pushing the boundaries of what the existing legislation says.
So it's not just a simple black and white issue. There are valid arguments on both sides. And like you said, even the court itself is divided on it. Okay, so that's the 2023 ruling you said. Now, I think you mentioned something about a 2022 decision as well.
Right, yeah. It might seem a little contradictory, but in 2022, the Supreme Court actually expanded the definition of family to include same-sex couples and queer relationships. And this was actually a really significant step towards at least recognizing the validity and importance of these relationships, even if it didn't grant them, full marriage rights.
Okay, so they are acknowledging those relationships, but then at the same time, they're saying marriage is off the table. Well, what's the key takeaway from all of this for our listeners who are preparing for the UPSC? They need to know exactly what the legal situation is right now.
Yeah, so as of right now, same-sex marriage is not legally recognized in India. It's important to remember that for the exam. However, the Supreme Court's decision to recognize same-sex couples as part of the broader definition of family, well, that opens up some interesting legal avenues. And it could potentially be used to argue for more rights down the line.
It's a little bit of a step forward and then a half step back, maybe. Now, a lot of the debate seems to be about the Special Marriage Act of 1954. Can you remind us, for those who need a little refresher, what this act is actually all about and why it's so relevant to the same-sex marriage discussion?
Okay, so the Special Marriage Act, or SMA, basically, it provides a way for couples to get married outside of their own religious personal laws. It was created initially to make things easier for intercaste and interfaith marriages, which often face a lot of opposition from traditional communities.
So it's kind of like a secular option for getting married, allowing couples to bypass all those religious restrictions. I could see how that could be really relevant for same-sex couples because they might face, probably DO, face similar resistance from, religious institutions. So how did the Supreme Court address this then?
So in their 2023 ruling, they specifically said that the SMA does not apply to same-sex couples. And they said this was because the language and the intent of the act is really focused on marriage between a man and a woman.
I can see that, but I'm a little bit confused here. One of the articles that I was reading mentioned that foreigners can get married under the SMA, and it doesn't matter what their religion is.
Yep.
So if it's supposed to be about those secular civil unions, then why wouldn't it apply to same-sex couples, especially if two foreigners of the same sex can use the SMA to get married right here in India?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And a lot of legal scholars and activists are saying the same thing. They're pointing out the inconsistency in how the SMA is actually being applied, because the fact that foreigners can use it for same-sex marriage, but Indian citizens can't, well, it creates a kind of legal paradox.
It does. And, I was thinking that kind of nuanced observation pointing out that inconsistency, that's exactly what could impress an interview panel, right? It really shows that you're not just memorizing facts, but actually thinking critically about the law and how it's applied
Absolutely. I mean, the UPSC is all about showing that you can analyze, you can think for yourself, not just, regurgitate information. And this case, with all of its complexities and different perspectives, is perfect for that kind of analysis. Before we move on to talking about the arguments for and against same-sex marriage, and believe me, there are some really strong arguments on both sides. So do you have any questions so far? Or anything you'd like to clarify? It's important to remember with the UPSC that it's not about knowing, like, the right answer. It's more about showing that you really understand complex issues, and that includes being able to explain different perspectives. So let's look at some of the arguments against legalizing same-sex marriage here in India.
Yeah, you're right. Sometimes we get so focused on the legal stuff that we forget that this is about people's lives and their beliefs, yeah. So what are the main concerns of the people who oppose same-sex marriage?
Well, a lot of the arguments come from, religious and cultural convictions. Many groups in India see marriage as this like sacred union between a man and a woman, something that's, ordained by God or by tradition. And they see same-sex marriage as a challenge to those very fundamental beliefs.
I can see how that could be a very sensitive point. For many people, religion and culture are so closely linked to how they view marriage and family. Can you talk more about how those beliefs turn into actual arguments against same-sex marriage?
Oh, yeah, sure. Some religious leaders and scholars, they point to like specific texts or interpretations within their faiths that define marriage as being between a man and a woman. They say that recognizing same-sex marriage would go against the very essence of their teachings.
So it's not just like a general traditional thing. It's rooted in their specific religious doctrines.
Yeah.
And how does that tie into the cultural aspect of it?
Well, in India, cultural norms and social values are often very closely linked to religious beliefs. There's this idea that allowing same-sex marriage would like disrupt the whole established social order and undermine the traditional family structure.
That's something I've heard before. But I'm wondering, historically, has the concept of family always been so rigidly defined in India? I mean, have there been alternative family structures or relationships that challenge this notion that there's only one right way to be a family?
That's a really great question, and it shows why it's important to look beyond those simple narratives. Historically, India has actually had a lot of different family structures and kinship systems. If you look at certain indigenous communities even, or some ancient texts, you'll find examples of relationships that don't fit neatly into this modern idea of a nuclear family.
So this idea that same-sex marriage is somehow foreign to Indian culture, that doesn't really hold up when you look at all of the historical and cultural complexities.
Exactly. It's so important to challenge those assumptions and look at it from different angles. And the UPSC, they love that kind of critical thinking and nuanced analysis.
Now, there's another argument that I've heard. It's focuses on the biological aspect of marriage.
hmm
Can you tell us more about this procreation argument?
Yeah, this argument is used all over the world against same-sex marriage. It basically says that the main purpose of marriage is procreation, continuing the family line. And because same-sex couples can't biologically conceive children together, the argument is that recognizing their marriages would go against that fundamental purpose.
So they're basically saying that marriage is only about having children. But what about families who choose not to have children? Or couples who can't have children because of infertility? Does that mean that their marriages aren't as valid?
You're right on the mark there, and that's exactly the kind of critical thinking the UPSC is looking for. You're pointing out the limits of that argument, how it doesn't take everything into account. You could easily argue that defining marriage only based on procreation is too narrow a view. It doesn't include all the emotional, social, legal aspects of marriage, right?
Exactly. It ignores all those same-sex couples who DO have children through adoption or surrogacy or other means. It's like they're ignoring all of that.
Yeah, and that's where you can use real-world examples to counter these arguments. You could talk about like the growing body of research that shows that children raised by same-sex parents do just as well as those raised by heterosexual parents. There's no difference.
Okay, so we've talked about the religious, cultural, and biological arguments. Are there any other major concerns from those opposing same-sex marriage?
Well, yeah. There are some concerns about potential legal and social problems that might come up. Some people say that if same-sex marriage was legalized, it would make things more complicated when it comes to inheritance laws, adoption rights, even personal laws about marriage and divorce.
So they're basically worried about changing the current legal system. Give some specific examples of the challenges they think might happen.
Sure. They worry about how property would be divided in a same-sex divorce, for example,
Mm.
or whether the adoption laws, which might be written more for heterosexual couples, would have to be changed completely. There's also the concern about how it would work with religious personal laws, which, currently are different for each religious community in India.
It is complicated when you have different legal systems all running at the same time.
Hmm.
I can imagine it would be difficult to sort all that out.
Exactly. And that's why some people say that these issues need to be really thought through and solutions found before any big legal changes are made.
So we've covered a lot today: religious arguments, cultural arguments, the whole procreation question, and even those legal issues. It's a much more complicated debate than I realized.
It is. That's what makes it such a good topic for the UPSC. It really makes you think critically,
Mhm.
analyze the different sides and see how law, society, and individual rights are all connected.
To really understand how India views this issue, I think it's helpful to look back at how LGBTQIA plus rights have changed over time in the country. Can you walk us through some of the big moments that have shaped the legal and social landscape as it is today?
Definitely. A timeline of LGBTQIA plus rights in India, that's essential for your UPSC prep. It helps you see how attitudes and legal views have gradually shifted over time.
Great. Give us those key dates and rulings that everyone studying for the UPSC should have memorized.
Okay. One of the biggest turning points was in 2014 with the National Legal Services Authority v. Union of India case. This judgment recognized transgender people as a third gender, moving away from just male and female. It was huge for recognizing gender identity, and it made way for more legal protections.
Wow, legally and socially recognizing a third gender, that's a really big step. What other important events should we know about?
Then, in 2018, there was the decision to decriminalize homosexuality. That was a huge one. The Supreme Court in Navtej Singh Johar v. Union of India, they struck down Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, which had made gay sex illegal for over 100 years.
Wow, so that got rid of a law that had been used to discriminate against LGBTQIA plus people for so long. That must have been a huge win for the community, a sign that the legal system was becoming more accepting.
It was a big shift, and it didn't stop there. In 2019, the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act was passed. It made their legal recognition even stronger and said no more discrimination against transgender folks in all parts of life.
So even though same-sex marriage isn't legal yet, these changes are making a more inclusive environment for LGBTQIA plus people and maybe making way for more changes to come.
Exactly. They show a definite trend toward greater acceptance and legal protection, and they provide the context you need to understand the whole debate about same-sex marriage. Now, if we go from the national to the international, we can see how India's stance on all this, especially same-sex marriage, compares to what's happening globally. And that's what we're going to talk about in the final part of our deep dive.
That's a great point.
Mm.
In today's world, what's happening globally can have a real impact on policies here in India. So stay tuned, everybody. We're going global next. All right, welcome back to our deep dive on same-sex marriage in India. We've covered the legal situation, the arguments for and against, and how LGBTQIA plus rights have changed over time here in India. Now we're taking it global.
Right, because for future policymakers and diplomats, it's really important to understand where India stands on the world stage, especially with something like same-sex marriage, which is a big topic in human rights discussions everywhere.
So what's the global situation? How many countries have actually legalized same-sex marriage? And when did this all really start?
Well, as of last year, over 30 countries have legalized same-sex marriage. The Netherlands, they were the first. Back in 2001, they actually changed their marriage laws to include same-sex couples.
Wow, 2001. Feels like forever ago, A&D just yesterday, given how much things have changed. What about other big countries like the U.S. or Canada?
Well, Canada, they followed in 2005, and then in 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage all across the country. That was a big one. Other countries like Australia, France, Spain, South Africa, they've all joined the movement too.
So it's happening all over the world, not just in the West.
Exactly. It's not tied to any specific region or culture. It's a global trend.
Okay, so there's a definite global trend toward legalizing same-sex marriage. What about closer to home, in Asia? Have any Asian countries made that change?
Asia's a bit of a mix, actually. Taiwan, they were the first in Asia back in 2019 to legalize same-sex marriage. It was a big moment, not just for them, but for the whole region.
So it's happening in Asia, even if it's not everywhere yet. Has Taiwan's decision had any impact on the debate in other Asian countries?
Definitely. In places like Thailand, Japan, Nepal, they have groups pushing for marriage equality. Taiwan's success is like an example for them to follow.
Okay, so things are changing little by little. For our UPSC folks, it's not just about knowing the facts, it's about the implications too.
Mm.
So what does this global trend mean for India? Does it put any pressure on India to change its stance?
Yeah, for sure. While India has its own legal system, global trends and international pressure can definitely play a role in shaping policy. As more countries, especially those that are close to India, start to accept same-sex marriage, it becomes harder and harder for India to just ignore it.
It's not just about legal arguments anymore, it's about India's image globally, its commitment to human rights, where it stands in the world.
Exactly. And that's something for all you UPSC aspirants to think about. This issue is going to keep coming up, both here in India and globally.
So, to sum things up for our listeners, we've covered a lot today. Right now, same-sex marriage isn't legally recognized in India, but same-sex couples are acknowledged under the wider definition of family.
Yeah. And we went through those main arguments for and against same-sex marriage, looking at the religious, cultural, legal, and social sides of it all.
And that really important timeline of LGBTQIA plus rights in India, showing how legal views and social attitudes have been shifting.
And we ended by looking at the bigger global picture, that growing trend toward legalizing same-sex marriage, and how that might influence what India does in the future.
It's been quite a deep dive. I feel like I just took a masterclass on same-sex marriage, both in India and around the world.
It was a deep dive, definitely. Hopefully, our listeners are feeling more prepared to deal with this topic, whether it's for their UPSC exams, a debate, or just to impress their friends with what they know.
Don't forget, the conversation doesn't end here. This is an issue that's going to keep evolving, so stay informed, stay engaged, and keep thinking critically.
If you like this deep dive, subscribe to our channel for more content like this, especially for UPSC, and share this episode with your friends who are also studying for the exams. We'll be back soon with more episodes to help you ace those exams. Happy studying!